Hi, Student Success. Welcome to your Chapter 11 lecture video. So we're going to go ahead and get into the chapter. As always, it's going to start off with a pre-assessment, kind of seeing where you are. Chapter 11 focuses on taking control of your finances, which I think what's nice about this chapter is we don't have to be in, a finance field to be able to appreciate and learn from this particular chapter, because the truth of the matter is, unfortunately, we all have to deal with our finances at some point or other for a good chunk of our lives. And so this can be a helpful chapter personally, as well as for some of you professionally, depending on what field you're going into. So again, just a real quick pre-assessment, some goals, some things you want to maybe learn or make sure that you master within the chapter, and then the chapter objectives, how we're going to get there. So this goes through and it talks about, really college is a time that is very stressful for people financially, on top of all the other types of stressors. But for younger students in particular, depending on if you're starting, at Stark State and then transferring or whatever the case may be, you may be living away from home for the first time. You may not be able to work as often as maybe you did over the summer or during the regular school year because your class schedule is a little different. You need to build in more time for studying. Your funds might just be limited in general for your wants, over your needs type thing. You may not have enough for your wants and you may not be used to that. And then there's other fees and things like that that are associated with college that sometimes just become a little bit even more of a burden. Non-traditional students, so students that are maybe a little bit wiser, you may also have some of the similar obstacles where your work schedule is changed to accommodate your schooling. And then you may also have, you're juggling a family and all these other things. And so money in college can be incredibly stressful. So the first section talks about, financial goals and realities. So think about, what are your financial goals? Understand where you want to be financially, both now as well as when you're getting ready to graduate. And so this kind of goes through a student situation, two students comparing and contrasting the situation that they're in and what they could have done differently to help their own situation. So here are some things to think about. It says, in terms of thinking about your financial goals, is it important to graduate without debt? Are you able to do that? First of all, it may not even be feasible to do so, but are you willing to take out student loans or work extra or whatever it might be done to either be okay having that debt or avoiding that debt completely? What are your priorities for free time? Are you going to work? Are you going to go to school? Are you going to get some resume building going on? Are you able to take full loads every semester? Are you going to take full-time classes so that you get done quicker? Or, what are your living situations going to be? So those are all, again, things to think about while you're in school. Something else our chapter then starts talking about is your wants versus your needs. So making sure that you are having a very realistic budget and sticking to it. It's great to have a very detailed, fanciful budget, but if you don't stick to that budget, then it's pretty useless. And so you want to make sure that you have that budget and consider your sources of income, how much money you're spending, and really trying to avoid debt at all possible to finance your education, because ideally you don't want that debt. I know it's not always avoidable, but ideally you don't want that debt after you graduate. So really sticking to a budget is going to try to help you at least get on that path. And so this chapter is going to go into ways to make money, ways to balance, ways to kind of view your money so that hopefully become a little less stressful for you. There are some kind of key takeaways, little checkpoint exercises. So this next section talks about making money. And of course, we all want to make money. That's why you're here in college. But we're talking specifically kind of while you're in college and then while you're thinking about the job that you want to get after you're done with college. So in addition to, paying for your bills and things, a job can both be either helpful or hurtful. I think it has the possibility of doing both, quite honestly. So when you're working, whether it's part-time, full-time, if you're able to do an internship, that's no pay, but that does help your resume, but you can't always work for no pay while you're going to school. That's not always very realistic. And so you have to kind of think about, how can I build my resume, but also support myself and make sure that you make the right type of decision for you. Some jobs will contribute more to your college experience. You think about the kinds of people that you're interacting with, how they might prepare you for future work. Are you in a job right now that is going to meet your needs? Are you going to be able to kind of be flexible with your hours? Can you use the job you have right now on your future resume? Again, everyone's situation is very different, but if you're able to get like a part-time job somewhat connected to the field you think you might be going in, a good example might be if you're going into education, getting a part-time job at like a daycare center, that type of thing, that not only allows income to be brought in, but it has a connection to your field as well. So those are all things to consider. Sometimes you come to school, you're already ingrained in the job you're in, so that's not a possibility for you to change positions. But you want to make sure the job that you have is ideal for you and your particular situation. There are student jobs on campus. We do have a lot of students who do like work study. They work to have, part of their tuition paid for. You can find job postings all over campus. You can also, look on Indeed or our version of Indeed, Handshake, to find those particular jobs. Of course, you can always kind of do your own work, a little bit of like side gigs or things like that. Again, we're still very much a gig economy. So there's some other examples there and some different resources for that. And then balancing the job you have with your ideal job. So obviously you may be working in a job right now, but that's not the career you want to go into. And so we sometimes have to kind of just balance that or negotiate that in our own heads that, we're in a job now to be able to get to that career. But sometimes we do have to acknowledge that, we have to sacrifice things or cut back on our hours or add our hours. And then making sure that we're just very aware of our expenses and our availability. There's a lot of research out there that focuses on students who both work and go to school. And what this research found, and of course, everyone's situation, again, I'm going to keep emphasizing, is unique to them. So when I quote research or use data or things like that, everyone's going to apply that differently. So I don't want to lump everyone in one category, but what this research found is that students who did not work at all and went to school full-time actually struggled with time management, the same or almost the same as students who worked full-time and went to school full-time. This research actually found that students who went to school part-time and worked part-time actually did the best job with their time management and money management because they had to. They were doing both things pretty equally, and so they're managing their time and then making that income. Now, working full-time might be more ideal for you financially, but it might hurt you academically, or vice versa. If you're not working at all, obviously you're going to hurt financially, but maybe be ahead academically. So those are all things to consider as well. Your particular situation, how much can you or do you need to work compared to, how much time are you going to school? Another little exercise. So this section talks about spending less, something we all might need to do a little bit more of, spending less, kind of ironic there. So this talks about, thinking about where does your money go? I always advocate for like a time analysis for people because we sometimes like, where does my time go? How am I spending all this time? Where's the result of this? The same thing can be done ideally for money. So trying to sit down for like a half an hour or whatever and go through your day and be like, how much did I spend on food, on transportation, on utilities? And you could just do that for ideally like a month will give you a really good idea. But even if you need to do it just for a week and just see how much money you're spending on things that are not necessary. I know my downfall sometimes is coffee. I make coffee at home, but then at least once a week, I kind of just want like a Dunkin' or a Starbucks. And I have to watch that because if I don't, I could be doing that every single day. And that's definitely not financially or healthy for me to do so. But it's still important that we buy our wants. We definitely want to take care of our needs, but I think it's still important to spoil ourselves sometimes with a fancy coffee or, like maybe you wanted to go to a concert, whatever the case is. So I'm not saying we need to ignore our wants, but we need to also make sure that we're paying attention to them in comparison to our needs. And so doing like a cost analysis, a spending analysis, what are you spending? Where can you cut back is really helpful. One thing I did a few years ago was we looked at, cutting our cable. This is probably more than a few years, but we cut our cable. We refinanced our home. We did like these little things that ended up making a big difference altogether. So looking to see where you could do some cutting. So this talks about kind of how sometimes people do spend a lot more on their wants than maybe they should, according to their own budget. And it's hard. It's hard to tell people, no, I can't go out, or I can't do this, or I can't, participate because of the money situation. But we also want to make sure we're setting ourselves up to not be stressed about our finances. And you also need to consider, what might your future costs be? Do you have another vehicle that you're going to have to buy in the next couple of years because the one you have right now is not great? So again, thinking big picture as well. So this all goes through kind of thinking about where does your money go? And then some kind of tips, or remember, be aware of what you're spending. Again, do that cost analysis. Look for alternatives. These are small tips, but sometimes it adds up. And I know sometimes some things are easier said than done. Plan ahead. If you're an impulse purchaser in particular, try to plan ahead, and then just be smart, find deals. So again, common sense stuff, but I'll be the first to admit I sometimes don't do the common sense stuff because I might impulse purchase something, even if it's like an impulse $20, purchase. It's not a ton of money, but maybe it just wasn't $20 I anticipated spending. So things like that, just really making sure that we are digging in and paying attention to how we are spending our money. Here's some other tips, on spending less. Managing a budget. Again, having a budget is great, but we need to make sure we follow it. So we want to do these 3 things: list all of our income, calculate all of our expenditures, and then make adjustments. So if we think, we're going to spend X amount of money monthly and we find out we're spending more or less, we need to adjust the budget and understand, where we need to take or kind of cut back. We also want to track our income, especially if you have multiple sources. Often in our society now, people have multiple streams of revenue. And so just knowing where all of your money is coming from, and it gives a little example of how to track it, but also tracking expenses. I have a spreadsheet that I fill out every other week that tracks our expenses, not necessarily our day-to-day, but like most of our bills and things like that. So I can look and see on a monthly basis how it's fluctuating or where I might have room. Now I have tracked my expenses on a weekly basis where I've broken it down to see how much we're spending on gas and, coffee or fast food or anything like that, because that can also be a great way to know where to kind of pull back on the spending. And so paying attention to your expenses is really helpful. And this gives another example of like, hey, are we considering all of these different things, or have we built it into our budget? And then this section talks specifically about balancing your budget, making sure that it is, this says put it on paper, or, do you have a spreadsheet, something? Do you have it somewhere concrete? It's just not in your head. You have typed it out on a spreadsheet, or you've written it down so that you can really look at it and try to make the adjustments or tweak it as needed. And it gives a little example of how you could use different online apps or websites to help manage your budget as well. And then what if it doesn't work? Think about how, I've been saving, or I've been doing this, I've been doing that, and things are still not going my way. This gives a little bit of advice and guidance on how to adjust if your budget is still kind of out of whack, if you will. So here are some examples of why we might spend too much. Old habits die hard. Some people are just used to spending money. Sometimes we spend way too much on credit cards when we shouldn't. I never have this problem because I don't say never. I hardly ever have cash on me. I don't know why. But it's easy, I think maybe for me, if I have cash on me, it's like, oh, this is like, I can just spend this. It's not coming out of my bank account, even though I know it totally is. But so sometimes having cash on us actually makes us spend more, but other times people are less inclined to spend cash. So just know your tendencies, I guess. Make sure that you're not tempted, and then make sure we're not buying just for gratification in the moment. Here's some financial trouble if you're like, I'm really having issues with my finances. Here are some warning signs. If your budget is kind of unbalanced for a few months in a row, if you're dipping into your savings, if you're missing deadlines, if your credit cards have a really large balance, you don't have an emergency fund, you don't even know what your debt is. So these are like little signs that, I should probably be really paying attention to my finances right now. This is balancing your checkbook. I'm not even sure how many people balance their checkbook anymore. It may not come as a shock, but I still balance my checkbook because I'm very regimented about our budget and things like that. So I like to have it right there in front of me, and I check it against the bank and everything. But even if you don't balance a checkbook, it's really important to still at least check in with your bank and see, what is your checking account sitting at and your savings account, so you always are aware. This section really focuses on saving for the future. What kind of things can you do to make sure that future you is in a good spot? And so this talks about, having an emergency fund, making sure that you're saving. And sometimes, again, that's easier said than done. I totally understand that. But even if you can tuck away $5 here and there and put it in an envelope or put it in a savings account, just doing something small for yourself to help kind of get ahead. And then this gives some examples on some other more in-depth saving, money markets, stocks, CDs, that type of thing. But I would definitely recommend checking in with an advisor or like a financial institution for that type of advice as well. Here's some other exercises. Then we start getting into credit cards. Credit cards can be very helpful. They can definitely help you build your credit and establish credit history. And they can definitely help in emergencies or when travel is going on. But we also know that credit cards have a lot of disadvantages too. So you want to make sure that you're prepared of the limits that you have on your credit cards. You want to try to make sure that you're not getting into extreme debt on your credit card. Younger people in general tend to find themselves in more credit card issues than a little bit older people. Not always the case, but because sometimes younger people get a credit card and they kind of go a little crazy. And so here are some tips on how to avoid that debt. Pay with cash, use your debit card if you can instead of credit. I always like to tell younger students, and I have, my son is getting to the age where he has a Venmo card and such. And we are going to, when he's 18 at least, have him get his first credit card. And we're just going to have him use it just for gas, just so that he gets gas on it every month. And then by the end of the month, he's going to pay it off, because that helps build your credit history without getting you into debt. So if you can get a credit card and just, save it for gas or save it for whatever it is, and then pay it off every month, that's establishing a credit history and giving you a chance to build a good credit score with your credit card. Avoid cash advances. Try not to have more than one credit card if you can. Keep track of all your purchases. My husband has like a folder in his email with all of he does like electrical work. So Home Depot or Lowe's, those receipts, and just to make sure you can go back through them if needed. And then if you find yourself having problems with your credit card, leave it at home. So that way you're not tempted, or you can't be tempted to purchase anything. This section talks about credit history and reports. If you're interested, you could type into Google like free credit report, and there is always a ton of, options here. I'm going to go ahead and put, oops, I did not want the image of that, but I'm going to go free credit estimator, and I'm going to go to my FICO. What's nice about this one is you do not have to put in your personal information. It takes you right to this spot. You could be anyone. I'm just going to randomly answer these questions just to kind of show you. So you can see, please don't do this, actually answer it. I am just really clicking through so you can see what it does at the end. All right, so that's without me putting in my personal information. And so if you don't have any idea what your credit score is, this gives you an estimate, and then it will tell you hey, here's kind of where to look. Obviously, the higher your score, the better, but often you need to even establish your history first. It may not even give you a credit score because you do not have anything established. So that's where having a credit card just for gas, or maybe your parents can put a utility in just your name to help build that credit. You can also, if you have student loans, if you're taking those out, you can start paying those now as a student, $10 every month. And then you establish a nice history of paying, and you're paying down your debt before you even graduate. So you want to make sure that you are aware of your credit history, your credit report. It's really important. Sometimes I can even see it's an arbitrary number. However, a lot of most institutions use those if you want to make a large purchase. So knowing your credit report, understanding credit history is really important as well. Just making sure also you review it, it's accurate, you're not seeing any red flags on there. This goes into more detail about what FICO is, kind of how all these factors get into it to create it. Making sure you're being safe. There's identity theft. This is getting, people get more and more creative as the years go on how to steal identity, and it is such a pain. if this happens to you, it takes about a decade in some cases to really set things right. And so these give you some guidelines on how to protect yourself from that. There's a little case study if you're interested in reading that and kind of thinking through that process. All right, we're starting to wrap up the chapter. So now we're getting into financing college. We want to make sure that we are being able to support ourselves in college while actually paying and going through college. And so it gives some, scholarships and grants. Those do not need to be repaid. Student loans, that does not need usually to be repaid. And then work study. So those are all great options that ideally, again, those two you want to go through. The student loans, you're not paying on them until after graduation. Although, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, you could start while you're here because it helps you get that credit history. Ideally, you want 1 and 3, right? Ideally, we would like to graduate without any debt. It's not always possible though. So you want to start with 1 and 3 and then you want to go to number 2. But this walks you through the FAFSA. A lot of you are probably already familiar with that unless you're completely CCP, but you have to fill out the FAFSA every single year. Even if you filled it out, you just filled it out, you're going to have to do it again for next year. So every year, and it's going to walk you through some general rules. Here again, scholarships and grants, that's free money. You do not pay them back, unlike your traditional student loans. So the more of those, the better. And it's going to give you some more information. And that's going to talk about student loans. It's going to talk a little bit about subsidized, what subsidized loan means and how we want to make sure that we're smart, how much we take out and borrow. Years ago when I started here, tuition was obviously just cheaper because of the time, but it was still pretty inexpensive. It would cost you maybe, I don't know, depending on how many credits you're taking, right? Like $5,000 to $7,000 to go here. We would have students take out $15,000. Obviously, you don't need that much. They would be buying things that were not school related. That's a great way to get yourself into some financial trouble because student loans is one thing that it's never going to go away. You cannot declare bankruptcy on them. You're going to be paying on them until you pay them off or until, unfortunately, you are no longer around. So you want to make sure that you're being smart about how much you borrow, looking at your rates, looking at the information, finding out if there's work study, things that are going to help you. And there's some tips on that. I do like to show you, if you go to the Stark State College homepage, so if I'm back here, there's a tab called Paying for College. And once you get here, if you click on scholarships, you'll have a lot of information here about scholarships. Here's a scholarship application, but then there's also a whole list of different scholarships that you can go down and click through. The one scholarship application right here that can see if you qualify for a good handful of them is so quick. Look at this. So quick. It's like checking a bunch of yes or no's, and then you'll hit submit. It is really worth filling that out to see what kind of scholarships you might qualify for. But also then you can scroll down and you can see, okay, well, we've got scholarships that are based on GPAs. We've got scholarships if you're older than 25. We've got scholarships if you're a CCP student, if you're in the honors program. So there are GPA and specific subsets, if you will. But then we also have degree-related scholarships. So if you're in the business field, if you're in health, there's scholarships for you there. There's other scholarships if you're a parent, if you are a veteran. So please check this out. I know some students are like, well, I don't want to fill out all these applications because it may or may not result in anything. Most of these do not require any type of essays. They're pretty quick applications. Now, even if you find a scholarship, for instance, a lot of times these external scholarships, there might be external scholarships that require essays or things like that go along with it. Even let's say it takes you 2 hours to write an essay, but it results in $500. I mean, I think that's 2 hours of time spent well. So keep that in mind. And often the college actually has money sitting and waiting for students because students sometimes don't realize that this money is there for them. So I always encourage students to just fill out the form. Just try. Here's some additional resources and some kind of end of the chapter activities and things like that. So if you have any questions on this content, please feel free and reach out.